One of my favorite quotes from JoJo's author, Hirohiko Araki, comes from when he's talking about creating the character Enya the Hag from Stardust Crusaders, where he says, "After all, I consider horror films to be my teachers and textbooks, and you can't have a horror film without a scary old lady." And goes on to mention how he went out of his way to try to fit in as many horror tropes into that character as possible, and points out JoJo's overall connection to horror films. So if you're at all familiar with this series, it's no surprise that Araki loves the horror genre and infusing its references and techniques into his own manga. You could even say he wrote the book on it. No, literally, Araki wrote an entire book analyzing horror films back in 2011, and contained commentary on nearly 100 movies broken down across its 10 chapters, each focusing on a different subgenre of horror. Of course, spanning the classics from Dawn of the Dead, Alien to Halloween, but goes all the way to modern horror for the time with segments on Paranormal Activity and I Am Legend. So what I find so endearing about JoJo is that although it's thoroughly horror-inspired, it manages to create its own identity by blending the genre with Araki's personal style, which I would say is more of a classic battle shonen meets homoeroticism due to the art style that emphasizes fashion, male characters, and human anatomy. Just combine that with Stephen King and it's not a half-bad description of the series. So with the spooky season now upon us, and being long overdue for a Halloween special, let's all get cozy and explore how the horror genre has shaped JoJo's bizarre adventure throughout the decades. Going back to January of 1987 is the start of it all with Phantom Blood, which is the most classic horror part of the entire series, taking large inspiration from gothic horror, specifically Bram Stoker's original 1897 novel, Dracula. But with there being so many different adaptations and interpretations of this original story, it's no wonder Araki found this classic to be a solid jumping off point for his manga, whether to borrow tropes, imagery, story structure, or maybe even intended for Phantom Blood to be his own legally distinct Dracula adaptation, as both of these stories are set in Victorian London during the late 1800s, with the main set pieces being manors, castles, and the streets of London. Both protagonists are Jonathan. I wonder where Araki pulled that one from, as these two heroes, Jonathan Harker and Joestar, fight against a malevolent vampire, eventually chasing him down through the countryside back to his castle with their band of heroes. In the original Dracula, there is also Jonathan's lover, Wilhelmina, also sometimes just referred to as Mina, who develops a psychic link with Dracula after being bitten, and much of the story revolves around freeing her from the Count's clutches. When in Phantom Blood, Jonathan's love interest is Erina, a similar name to Mina, as these two couples very much parallel each other. Although Erina ended up being far less important in the narrative, but there is still those elements of Dio's evil nature attempting to corrupt her, much like Dracula and Mina. And one of the beautiful things about Dracula is the multitude of interpretations, where in the original he's mostly trying to torment Jonathan and ruin his life, attaching to Mina as an act of revenge, although there is still romantic and erotic themes littered throughout that other adaptations deviate towards quite heavily, where Dracula's romantically obsessed with Mina and wants to steal her from Jonathan. And in Phantom Blood we find a unique blending of Dracula's motives, as one of Dio's underlying goals was to corrupt Jonathan's spirit, almost like Araki wanted Jonathan to fulfill both roles of Dracula's rival and devotee, which is some of the early beginnings of JoJo's homoerotic themes, with men often fulfilling women's roles narratively. Although I don't think Dio was ever really sexually interested in Jonathan, as the relationship is much more spiritual and representative of the forces of good and evil, where it would seem Dio has a lustful obsession with Jonathan, but because he is the ultimate trial for Dio's will, which is to conquer humanity and dominate all forms of life. So throughout the story, we constantly see Dio chipping away at Jonathan's heart, stealing his first kiss, tormenting him, killing his family, all attempts to turn the human spirit, making Jonathan akin to his white whale, an ambition forever unfulfilled. As even in Jonathan's final moments, he gracefully holds Dio's severed head in a loving embrace, and dies before his eyes without ever losing his nobility. And you can see in Dio's face this spiritual loss, which you could argue was the catalyst for all of his future endeavors, this ultimate defeat fueling Dio's never-ending lust for power, and stealing Jonathan's body being just a crude imitation of his true goal, so he settles on turning the physical body into a puppet when unable to conquer the spirit. So although although Phantom Blood has this tragic end, it ultimately captures the theme of Dracula, or really any vampire story: the undead versus humanity, the human spirit versus evil. And I could go on a lot longer about Dracula. We still have the Zeppeli and Van Helsing parallel, an eccentric teacher who fights vampirism, but there is much more to Phantom Blood than just Dracula, as Araki threw in a bit of everything into this part, with undead warriors, zombies, monster creations, and fictionalized depictions of real-life killers, like the infamous Jack the Ripper. But lastly, on the topic of Phantom Blood are its striking connections to another defining work from classic gothic horror, and that's the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And yes, even for how weird it feels to say, Jekyll is apparently the correct pronunciation according to the original author. Although since the Jekyll pronunciation was popularized by the 1931 film adaptation, it's stuck ever since, and that's how most people say it, so I guess both are acceptable now since you'll probably get corrected either way. So when it comes to the character Dio, the most common association is Dracula, because vampire of course, but I think Dio is actually a great portrayal of Dr. Jekyll, as Dio is a bad person who hides his true nature from the world, masquerading as a trustworthy and innocent man, which is very reflective of the source material rather than the multitudes of misinterpretations and adaptations in general pop culture, which depict Jekyll and Hyde as two separate personalities within the same body, a case of dissociative identity disorder more similar to Diavolo, when in truth, the story is about a bad man with a good reputation, who drinks a magic potion that changes his appearance so he can get away with doing bad things, like murder. As the alternate persona, Mr. Hyde, is quite literal, he uses it to hide his true nature. And if we look at Dio in the Joestar mansion compared to the streets of London, we can see his Jekyll and Hyde. In the presence of George, he can never let the mask slip, he must be upstanding and trustworthy, as to win over the family fortune, which is another key plot point from the 1886 novella, with the heir to Dr. Jekyll's will changing throughout the story. But when we see Dio on his own, he is violent and he consumes alcohol, a substance which many see as an allegory to Dr. Jekyll's magic potion, something that allows his dark side to come out and act freely. And this allows Dio to be himself, following in his father's footsteps. Although Dio's tastes quickly grow from substance to power, and this was Dio's true side, which he was able to fully embrace through the ancient power of the stone mask, which can be seen as a much more accurate parallel to Dr. Jekyll's magic potion, as it enables his violence and changes Dio's body, but not his mind, and allows him to be his true self. To quote Oscar Wilde, a poet from the late 19th century, "A man is least himself when he talks in his own person. Give him a mask, and he will tell you the truth." And this is as true of Dr. Jekyll as it is Dio, who was forced to constrain himself and lie when bound to his human form, but able to unleash his wicked self when freed from consequences, which makes Dio a beautiful twist on this classic story. So overall, Phantom Blood is an absolute gem of gothic horror adapted for manga that, like its inspiration, takes on this timeless feel, and lays a horror-rich foundation for what's to come. Also, a trend started in part 1 is nods to probably Araki's favorite author, Stephen Kane, who you can find all over the series. In part 1, there's Wing Knight's Lot, a port town overlooked by Dio's castle, that is slowly invaded by the undead, a not-so-subtle nod to Salem's Lot. Now entering the next era of JoJo, we have Battle Tendency that really shifts genres towards more of an action-adventure. So if part 1 is Araki's personal adaptation of Dracula, part 2 is his Indiana Jones, with Joseph's personality being very indie-inspired with a healthy dose of Stallone, and lots of similarities to Raiders of the Lost Ark. So although Araki often borrows heavily a lot of story structure and imagery, in the end he creates such a unique plot it's a far cry from derivative or plagiarism. Just copy a handful of things at a time, throw in an original cast, stands or hormone, and boom, now it's original. As mixed into part 2's adventure story is a great deal of horror, with returning monsters like the vampires and zombies, but also new ancient deities known as the Pillar Men, who give off this sci-fi, otherworldly feeling of dread, and I always saw them as this combination of the Xenomorph from Alien and the Terminators. When we first see the fossilized Santana, the architecture of the cave directly references the abandoned ship from the beginning of the original Alien movie, and presents the Pillar Men as these foreign life forms from an ancient Earth. And when Joseph gets to directly interact with them, it really does feel like sci-fi horror, where these monsters look human but are capable of anything, which creates such an unsettling feeling. and although released a few years after the manga, the Pillarmen always reminded me of the fear I felt as a kid watching the T-1000 model in Terminator 2. The way they interact with the world, they could just completely disregard humans, walk right through them, and just are this unstoppable force you feel like all you can do is run away from. But overall, a lot less horror in part 2 I feel, and much more battle adventure, as Araki was trying to figure out how to evolve this story, and use the Pillarmen to up the stakes and expand the original lore and power system going into their elemental abilities, really trying to push the supernatural aspect of the manga to its limits here. And that brings us to Stardust Crusaders, where JoJo finally found its secret sauce through stands, these psychic powers unique to each user that would bring Araki's love for horror back into full effect. With each stand encounter really being their own mini-movie that created this more episodic story structure and made it possible to jump from one crazy or horrific idea to the next without the manga completely losing its identity. And you can tell at the start of this part, Araki really was just having fun with stands, riffing horror movie after horror movie, from Jaws to Ghost Ship to Child's Play, The Blob, The Thing, Christine, Basket Case, Nightmare on Elm Street, the list goes on. And it was all back to back to back, with nearly every single arc having a movie villain or a direct horror movie reference. And still to this day, part 3 has the most stands within it, despite being the shortest part in terms of page count with stands, which I think when viewed through a modern lens has depreciated the story for some, with Stardust often being criticized for having a lot of these inconsequential arcs that do result in a drawn-out narrative. Although for me personally, and I think for anyone who's able to recognize Stardust as a product of its time, you can grow to love this story more and more as time passes, as it comes off a lot less serious than the later parts and is like that campy 80s horror movie that just gets better with age and you love it forever, with each viewing and imperfection adding more to its charm than anything, being this perfect time capsule of classic horror movies wearing an oversized JoJo trenchcoat. And the horror influence of Stardust runs a lot deeper than just these borrowed villains and Stephen King references, as with the return of Dio 100 years later, Araki also had the idea for this part to be a modern retelling of Dracula. This was said to be the first idea he pitched, which confused most of his editors, and they encouraged him to have more Japanese characters to appeal to the target audience. So in the end, the story starts in Japan, and our main character is Jotaro Kujo, who carried a lot of Clint Eastwood Western cowboy vibes, but mixed with Koichi Yamano from Babel 2. So although the story ended up being more like JoJo's take on Around the World in 80 Days, there are still elements of that modern retelling, specifically drawing heavily from the final third of the Dracula story, where we have a multicultural band of heroes chasing the Count across Europe back to his castle for a final showdown, by using the phenomenon of psychic links, with Mina using her link with Dracula to feel and see through him, which helps the heroes track him down. And that's exactly how the Joestars find Dio's castle in Egypt, using their ancestral link to Jonathan's body to create spirit photos using Hermit Purple, which is Joseph's stand, but also a power we saw Dio was able to use as well. Call it Jonathan's stand or whatever, but all we really see Dio do is create a spirit photo. So I feel like this is just a unique visual representation of their psychic link that is depicted in a more JoJo way than just visions in their head, by using analog and expresses the physical connection between Dio and the Joestars. And this new rendition of Dio in part 3 is a much more accurate representation of Dracula than his part 1 self, where after the 100-year slumber at the bottom of the ocean, he truly is the product of an old world, and comes off more like a haunting ghost than a physical body, especially the scenes in his castle that depict him as extra elusive, all enhanced by the mystery of his stand, where it would seem he vanishes before your eyes or becomes the shadows themselves. Really makes him feel otherworldly, which all work together to create this strong image of Araki's own interpretation of Dracula, which is a sexy 1980s muscle vampire who can stop time, but in the end it suffers the same fate as most Dracula adaptations, burning away by the light of a sunrise. Moving into part 4 now, which is my personal favorite part of JoJo, and what I think is the best horror story and setting the series has ever depicted. From the small town mystery to its endearing heroes and chilling main villain, it just scratches every itch, and I find myself returning for a rewatch nearly every year. So what sets this story apart from the rest is the setting of Morio, the remote metropolitan on the east coast of Japan that entertains a bustling cast of characters, who we encounter throughout its chapters that are all living their own lives and play a part in bringing the city to life, which creates a sense of familiarity and care for those characters that makes the horror element of a serial killer tormenting the town ever more compelling. So unlike the previous parts where we're fighting zombies, Aztec gods, and Dracula, part 4 grounds the story quite heavily by by isolating the stakes to just this small town and crafts a more realistic narrative that could be possible if we took away the stands, as Killer Queen is really just a murder weapon and Kira is just a killer. The town of Morio, while based on the author's hometown of Sendai, also carries heavy Western influence from the horror mystery TV series Twin Peaks, which has been a recent interest of mine. I've been enjoying this Halloween season, but it finished airing in the early 90s due to cancellation just a year before Part 4 began, and Araki had mentioned the series in an author note during the tail end of Part 3 during the Vanilla Ice fight, saying, "I took the plunge and bought Twin Peaks on Laserdisc. I enjoy the manga-like aesthetic it has." So it's no stretch to say that the setting and plot of Mark Frost and David Lynch's Twin Peaks was a massive inspiration for Part 4, both being small-town murder mysteries with supernatural and surreal elements that follow a similar structure. We enter this remote town that appears ordinary and quiet but turns out to be anything but, with each resident being more bizarre or sinister than the last, creating all kinds of subplots and adventures while working towards the larger goal of finding the killer within. The first villain of Part 4, notorious killer Angelo, is even directly named after Twin Peaks composer, Angelo Badalamenti. And then we have Jotaro Kujo returning in a supportive role, which could be described as the lead investigator in the Kira case, quite reminiscent of FBI Special Agent Dale Cooper, who is assigned to work the Laura Palmer case in Twin Peaks. In the anime, an extra scene was added to show Jotaro driving into town, possibly a nod to Cooper's introduction. These two also stay at their town's luxury hotels, the Morio Grand Hotel and Twin Peaks Great Northern, which have a similar exterior. There's also some numeral similarities, like the population size of Morio and Twin Peaks both being around 50,000, when in reality Sendai would have been closer to 1 million. Jotaro and Cooper's room numbers, while not exact, are curiously close, 315 and 324, just down the hall from each other. And without getting too deep into spoilers, so a light warning, Twin Peaks is a very surreal and scary place where the forces of good and evil wage war and can influence its residents or speak to them like ghosts in dreams, bringing people outside of time and space, instances of limbo to some extent. So it's no surprise we find similar phenomena within Part 4 that goes far beyond the realm of stands, with ghosts who are trapped in an in-between, victims of the town's killer that help us by giving clues to his identity, a plot point ripped almost straight out of Twin Peaks and wouldn't be the last. The owls and trees are reoccurring imagery in the show with more to them than meets the eye.
Sheriff, what kind of fantastic trees have you got growing around here? Big, majestic.
Douglas firs.
Douglas firs.
And those same motifs can be found on the Morio town flag. And nearly all of this Twin Peaks DNA extends to JoJo's 8th part JoJolion as well, which takes place in an alternate Morio that's practically identical to the original but with some new landmarks, such as the twin pine trees, which are almost certainly in reference to the title Twin Peaks and the Douglas firs, with the twin pine trees representing the idea of morality. Good and evil in the story being the location of the blessed lands that are almost always depicted in association with extreme moral conflicts, being the source of miracles and calamity. It's a special place where good and evil meet and become one, which is expressed through its power of equivalent exchange, which is one of the only ways for positive and negative forces to exist symbiotically, which is kind of the main idea for such a place as Twin Peaks, a town that exists in the valley of pure good and evil. JoJolion especially emphasizes mystery and surrealism that explores these complex ideas of dreams and irrationality, drawing a connection to not just Twin Peaks but all of David Lynch's work, which I've only recently had the pleasure of discovering, and who sadly passed away earlier this year, but was able to return to Twin Peaks in 2017 for its 3rd season, The Return, which in a strange coincidence had happened at the same time Araki was writing JoJolion, which was his own return to Morio 20 years later, and both of their returns explored alternate universes with incredibly surreal narratives, which makes me feel that somehow these worlds of Morio and Twin Peaks are cosmically connected beyond the intention of their creators. So originally this video was supposed to cover all of JoJo, but the topics of Dracula and Twin Peaks just naturally expanded and took over most of the script, so I'll tie things off nicely here if I want to get this out in time before Halloween, and I kinda like what it evolved into, being two separate but still JoJo and spooky related discussions, kind of a double feature vibe. And the later parts, 5, 6, 7, while still scary, aren't as horror rich as the early parts, so I really didn't have a big topic in mind and would have been mostly smaller references here and there. So while the Halloween season is still still upon us, or whenever you stumble across this, I really encourage you guys to just get out there and go watch horror movies. Experience some of the influences we looked at today, especially the stuff you've never seen or read before. Because if you love JoJo, you'll love what inspired it and can give you a whole new perspective on something that may feel so familiar. For example, after watching Twin Peaks just this last couple weeks, I saw part 4 in a whole new light. A story I knew like the back of my hand just took on this new shape. So get out there and enjoy some horror. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please drop a like if you enjoyed. Greatly appreciate it. Subscribe for more, and I'll talk to you all real soon in a new video. Peace out.